that going, I just wanted to facilitate an introduction. So our host for tonight's workshop is Caroline Twombly, and Caroline is a budget analyst through the Apostle Island and Voyageurs National Park Service. So she is very well versed in all things federal employment. And she'll be going through, a lot of the information that I see you all are interested in getting from what you've added to the chat. So Caroline, I'm going to turn it over to you when you are ready.
I'm ready.
Great. You should be able to go ahead and start sharing here.
All right. As Julie mentioned, I am a budget analyst for Apostle Islands National Lakeshore and Voyageurs National Park. But prior to my switch into administration with the Park Service, I was formerly with interpretation and education, and I worked 7 years as a seasonal before becoming permanent at 3 different parks. And so I have applied to a lot of jobs over the years. And so a lot of this information that I'm sharing with you tonight will be firsthand experience, as well as now just some of the things that I know from being on the inside. How you can kind of beef up your resume, how you should be answering some of the questions that you'll find on the application, and what to look for kind of with your eligibility and qualifications in those job announcements, so you're not wasting your time on things you don't need to be applying to. With that, I am mostly going to assume that many of you are looking towards a career with a government agency. I will talk about temporary seasonal jobs because those make great stepping stones to get into a permanent career position. My work experience is with the Park Service, so that will be my primary example, but I am going to be talking about some of the other agencies that exist out there that have jobs that sometimes are a little easier to get in with permanently than the National Park Service. And then once you're in permanently as a federal employee, it's easier to move around to other agencies that maybe you want to work for down the road. So that's just something to know. I am going to start in USA Jobs talking about different hiring paths. And let's see if I can get my screen to share. Here we go. So USA Jobs, if you have not been there yet, is usajobs.gov, and it can be really intimidating. You will want to set up an account within USA Jobs. But on the homepage, there's a lot of good information that I want to cover a bit about some of the hiring paths that can get you into the Park Service. These hiring paths essentially determine if you're eligible to apply to a job. So sometimes you'll see job announcements out there that are for like a biologist. It says it's a GS9. You're like, I want to make that kind of money. And you apply, but you get pushed back because you are not considered eligible. If that job wasn't open to the public and you've never been a federal employee before, you're going to get pushed back because you're not considered eligible for that job. So when you're looking at job announcements, these little icons that are with all these hiring paths are going to be your key to knowing what you can actually apply for to be looked at and considered and what you can't. And so the big one is anything that's open to the public. So this light blue icon, this means you can apply to it. Anybody off the street who's a US citizen can apply to this job. Federal employees, so this dark blue icon with a little, I don't know, museum in it. This is a job announcement that's only open to current or former federal employees. At this point, that's probably not you. This also does not include temporary or seasonal employees. So that's a hard thing to distinguish out sometimes. Once you're in a federal agency, you're like, what kind of position am I in? If you're in a temporary position, you still won't be eligible for anything that's with this dark blue circle. However, there are some important other hiring authorities that are available, particularly for students and recent graduates. So this is something you want to watch for. Any sort of yellow icon that's a student or recent graduate with a job announcement is one you want to be looking at. There is actually one out there tonight that I'm going to show you guys that's for a student. And student means you are enrolled in some sort of education program, whether it be undergraduate or graduate. Recent graduates you have to be within 2 years of your graduation date to apply to that job. And these are being used a lot more often. This is also called the Pathways program. So if you hear that phrase ever, and these are just a great way to start as a student, get your foot in the door, and then many times they can actually convert these to permanent positions without further competition. Some of them are only temporary, some of them are just like an internship experience, but that's still valuable work experience that you're getting. So you're looking for essentially these two icons. The student one is the book, and the graduate cap is the recent graduate ones, where you have to be within 2 years of getting your degree. There is also another hiring authority that they bury under the federal employees that's really important, and it just, well, I shouldn't say just, it's probably been about 5 years now that this became an option. But if you, through working on temporary jobs that you applied to through USA Jobs, if you, there we go. If you have worked a total of 24 months, so that's 2 years in these temporary jobs, you are then eligible to apply to anything that has an icon with this little tree in it. And this is really critical for you to understand or know this is an option out there when you first get started, so that you're just aware and kind of tracking your time that you're working for the federal government. Because these positions, this job announcement means it cuts out extra competition from, it being open to everybody else in the United States. This means that there'll be fewer people that you're competing against to get a job, which can really increases your odds of getting that job. So this is something just to know about as you're starting out, that working temporary or term for the federal government is not a waste of your time. I wish this had been around when I was a seasonal and trying to get in permanent. It was not. So it's just something to know about, but they do bury that information under the federal employees because you're basically being able to compete after 24 months of time total. You can have breaks in your time, like obviously if you're a seasonal employee and you're only working every summer, like in between when you're between years in college or after college, it'll take you a little bit of time to build up to that 24 months total, but you at least know you're working towards something. And these hiring paths are really what determine your eligibility. And that's a term that HR uses just to weed out whether or not you can actually apply to a job. It has nothing to do with your qualifications. And that's really important to remember, because I think applying to federal jobs can be the most damaging thing to your self-esteem that you ever do. Because often you'll get knocked back because either tons of other people who are qualified are applying, or you're just deemed not eligible. And eligible doesn't mean you're not qualified. So, talking about, as I mentioned, like a biologist position, it's a GS-9, but if it's only open to federal employees, you could have all of the qualifications in the world. You could be an amazing biologist for a nonprofit somewhere, but if you're not a federal employee, you're not going to be eligible for a job that's only open to current federal employees. And that's just reality. It's kind of a bummer. It does narrow the candidate pool for parks who are looking, or for agencies who are looking for folks who already have experience in the federal government. So those are the different hiring authorities, and it's looking for those icons when you're actually searching for jobs. And so the USA Jobs main site, you can search for anything that the federal government hires for, which can be a little overwhelming. For an example tonight, I'm just going to go with the National Park Service because it's one, what I know best, and two, because they have a job announcement out that's going to be helpful for most of you guys who are looking at going into natural resources. The National Park Service, if you just type in National Park Service, it'll give you a whole lot of filters. Well, it'll give you a bunch of jobs that are open right now through the National Park Service as an agency. And then on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll have the option to filter. So you can filter by the hiring path. So, you know, if you know that you are not a federal employee, you wouldn't want to check any of these. You'd say, okay, I'm looking for anything that's open to the public. So this would be open to me. I might be looking for, where'd it go? Oh, seriously. So earlier today, there was actually a student job open, but it already closed, which figures. So that's too bad. That was going to be my great example. But you can also look for students, recent graduates. Great way to narrow it down by something that you know you can be eligible for and not waste your time. Under more filters, you also have, you know, the type of work schedule you might be looking for, full-time, part-time, and then appointment type. And appointment type is basically the type of job you're looking at. And I don't mean like biologist or forestry technician, like how you're appointed. So you could look for a permanent job. I'd also be looking for temporary. That'll give you anything that's seasonal. If you're flexible, you know, just kind of look at everything. Make sure those are all checked so you're not missing something. And then when you go back to your job announcement, you'll see, or to your listing of job announcements, you'll see the actual title of the position, the agency that it's working for, and then under it is actually the department, because the National Park Service falls under the Department of Interior. Same with Fish and Wildlife Service falls under the Department of Interior. USGS falls under the Department of Interior. BLM, most of your land management agencies fall under the Department of Interior, with two very important exceptions. And one of those is the U.S. Forest Service, and they are under the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And the other one is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and they fall under the Department of the Army. And the Army Corps of Engineers is not one that a lot of people think about, but they run some incredible recreation areas across the country. And they also have a lot of money because they're Department of Defense. And so they are usually not hurting for money to pay for positions. So it's something to think about. Consider looking at the Army Corps, especially just to get your foot in the door as a permanent employee. It may not be your dream job. It may not be your dream mission. And that's fine, but it's a way to get your foot in the door, and then you could transfer over to a position with USGS or the Fish and Wildlife Service or the National Park Service. So just keep in mind that while Department of Interior really houses most of the land management agencies, there are a couple exceptions out there that are worth your time to look at. And the U.S. Forest Service also is a great agency to work for. Little different mission. They do a lot of forest management in the sense of logging and things like that. So it's just, you know, each agency is different. So on the right-hand side of each job announcement, it'll tell you usually what kind of job it is. This one is permanent full-time for a dispatcher. By the way, they're always looking for dispatchers everywhere in the Park Service if you ever want to do that. This is a temporary one. So this is a seasonal position. It's a maintenance one, the laborer. And, you know, so you're limited to a shorter amount of hours. It'll tell you the typical season, usually when they expect you to start. So the stuff on the right is just good to know kind of what you're getting into when you start looking at jobs. Let's see if I can find one that's related to resources. So this is a park guide, so this is going to be interpretation and education, but for the sake of being able to look at a job announcement, it'll help us. So this is a student trainee position, so this is a good one for somebody who's currently enrolled in college or graduate school. We know that it's a pay grade, it's a GS3. And I would say that if you're in college, you could be looking at anywhere from a GS3, and that's just a pay scale, GS3 to GS5. Once you graduate, you should probably be looking from a GS4 to a GS7. If you go to grad school with a master's degree, you can actually qualify for a GS9 position. So that's just something to keep in mind. You know, you may see these great GS12 positions somewhere and you're like, I want to do that. I would be great at that job. But often there are requirements to actually have time worked in the federal government at a 9 or an 11 level before you can reach those upper levels. So when you're first starting out of college, anywhere from a GS4 to a 7 is a great place to be searching in your job search. It'll give you a little information about your work schedule, appointment type, the location for this one is in Florida. It'll also, yeah, never mind. That's not really that important. One of the big important things in these job announcements is your duty. Okay, you need to be reading these very closely so that you know that, yes, this is a job I could do. They'll usually tell you where it's located. Sometimes they don't. Which is kind of funny, but sometimes they don't. It'll give you the responsibilities. And so you can see this one will deliver interpretive programs to educate visitors, talks, briefings, etc., etc. This information in this responsibilities section under the duties, you should make sure that your resume speaks to you having the skills to do these things. And when I say speaks to it, sometimes use almost verbatim the same language that you see in these job announcements in your resume somewhere. It'll then go on to talk, you know, if there's anything required with it, like if you're stuck being a supervisor, if you're a low graded, if you're like a 4 to a 7 graded employee, don't sign up for supervisory status. That's my personal advice to you. It will go on to talk about requirements, which is important. You know, many times there will be something where you need to have a driver's license because you will be required to operate a motor vehicle for the Department of Interior, whatever agency. And it's critical to have that driver's license. For that, you won't be able to, some jobs you actually won't be able to enter on duty without it. We had a kind of close call this summer with somebody. It'll talk about qualifications. And so this is also really important to read. They will be ranking you and you will have to select an answer to telling how you qualify for this job. And so it'll tell you, in this particular one, possess 6 months of general experience. This is super broad. This is not a great example, but it'll tell you usually if you need like a year of experience at what they call the GS4 level, and then it'll describe in this section exactly what that experience looks like. It may be doing field work, doing water quality studies. They will tell you exactly what that experience is that you need to qualify for the position. And you need to demonstrate in your resume that you have done those things before in order to qualify for the position. You also can qualify based on education. If you have, this one is a GS3, so all you need is 1 year of education above a high school. But oftentimes for GS5s and GS7s, you just need to have successfully completed a bachelor's degree. GS4s, you usually just need, I think it's 2 years, however many semester hours that is. They'll ask you, you can use your education to qualify for a job. You tend not to rank as high as somebody who has actual work experience, but you can get through using your education to qualify. And as you go down, there will provide just tons of extra information that can be really overwhelming. The other section that you really need to pay attention to, well, I guess there are 2 of them. The required documents will tell you exactly what you have to provide if you're going to apply to this job. One of them is always a resume, which I'll show you how to build in USA Jobs in a bit. The other is completing the occupational questionnaire. This questionnaire is the job announcement, and we'll go through that in a second to show you what they look like. But it's just completing the questionnaire, the questions that they ask you, and ranking yourself. You're basically self-ranking on your experience. So I don't talk about veterans preference a lot in this presentation, just from my past experience is that I usually don't have veterans in this particular course, but if you do want to talk to me about that afterwards, I'm happy to do that. Veterans do get a point preference when they apply to jobs with the federal government. So that's just something good to know if you are a veteran. And then for this particular job, because it's a student one, you will need to provide college transcripts or an acceptance letter. College transcripts can be informal when you apply to a job. If you don't have your formal transcripts yet, they can be informal. When you are actually interviewed and they start to hire you for a position, you will have to provide your formal transcripts from your college. And always make sure your college transcripts, whether they're formal or informal, have your college name on them. I've heard there was a horror story where somebody didn't get past HR to be put on a list for consideration of a job because her college wasn't listed on her transcript. So that's something just to make sure that Northland College is on your transcript somewhere. And that's just so that they can make sure that your institution is a accredited university. So last but not least, one of the most important things that you will want to look at in a job announcement, and not every agency has this, but every Park Service job has this, and most other agencies under DOI, so that includes Fish and Wildlife Service, USGS, they will have an option to preview the questionnaire for the job announcement. Always look at this. So this will give you an idea of exactly what they're looking for with the job. The first many questions will be about your eligibility. And so these you just have to read carefully as you go through. You know, are you claiming veterans preference? No, I'm not claiming veterans preference. Are you a current or formal federal employee displaced from an agency hiring for this position? No. So you just click no. Sometimes you will be clicking yes, you know, that you are, goodness, they ask a lot. Okay, so, you know, you're verifying that yes, you're a student or you're accepted for enrollment, so you'd want to say yes. These questions are really important to read carefully. And many of them don't apply to you. And if you honestly are reading this going, I don't know what that is, it means it doesn't apply to you. And so your answer is going to be no. As you go down and get past all the eligibility questions, you will actually enter into where they're ranking your qualifications. And the first question is always, Select one statement that best describes your experience and or education that demonstrates your ability to perform the duties of blank job. This one is park guide. And this is where you're saying, yes, I have, 6 months or a year of that work experience or general experience. By the way, volunteer time counts towards work experience. Even things that aren't paid count as work experience for the federal government. So that's something to keep in mind. Or if you're going to try to qualify in education, saying, yep, I have that required education that makes me eligible for this job. And then you'll go down and actually get into the meat and potatoes of this, which will ask you, present informal talks, guided tours, demonstrations, blah, blah, blah. Respond to questions. And this is all obviously park guide. I can tell you when I'll actually pull up an example from the BLM for a hydrotech in a minute, just to give you a better idea of what that looks like. So each one of these questions, you are ranking yourself A through E here. And this often throws people because E is where you want to be the most often, but you can't lie. So you need to back up anything, if you're ranking yourself as really high for something, you need to back that up on your resume. And so, people here say, well, I'm not an expert. I don't know everything about this. The thought process is if you've done it a few times on the job, you are an expert. So the meaning of the word expert here can really throw people off. So I just tell people have a very high confidence day when you're applying to a job, because you want to rank yourself highly, as high as you can, without lying. So if you had never given an informal talk here or guided tour, you can't rank yourself as an expert because you can't prove that on your resume anywhere. So you would have to rank yourself somewhere up here. This can be really hard for people just because most of us all want to be really honest about, how we feel our experience is. But the more often you can get to E, the better off you will be when HR looks at your information. The other thing is these questions will provide you a great wealth of information, not only about the job, but things you should be speaking to in your resume. So sometimes these questions will tell you that you need to have experience with a certain type of software or a certain type of GPS. Make sure that in your resume, when you're talking about whether it's work experience or volunteer experience or class experience, field experience, make sure you are very, very specific about equipment and technology that you have used. I mean, I put in Microsoft Excel into my resume because these all go through a central HR office. It is not the park or the refuge looking directly at your resume until it comes from the central HR office. So there's somebody looking at your resume and your materials who really probably doesn't know exactly what the job is, but they're trying to match your information with what they know, what the hiring official gave them in these questionnaires. So just please, please, please be really specific about your stuff. It's going to seem like total overkill when you're doing a resume, but it's absolutely necessary. I can't reiterate that enough. It is absolutely necessary. I'm going to try to pull up the PDF that I saved of this hydrotech position with BLM and reshare my screen, because I think this is really valuable just as far as questions go to look at. And I know we have at least one person who's interested in hydrology. This is also a good example because some job announcements they'll be hiring for several different locations, and you'll have the option in the questionnaire section to select one or all of the locations. I would say if you're flexible, select as many as you can. I understand now with seasonal positions for the Park Service, they will put, if they're hiring a GS5 park ranger, they will put like Apostle Islands, Voyageurs, Badlands, St. Louis Arch, like all these parks together on the same job announcement. And they'll list all those locations out. And I think now you can only select a certain number. You can't just go through and select all of them. So if you do run into that, make sure you're selecting ones that you would accept a job to. But for a lot of the other ones for agencies outside of the National Park Service, you can select as many of the geographic locations as you would like. This position was also advertised as a 5, 6, 7 position, which means you may come in at the GS5 level, but once you do a year of work and it's satisfactory work, you'll then automatically be bumped up to a GS6. And same thing, after a year of work at the 6 level, get bumped up to a 7. These are nice kind of career ladder positions that just kind of boost you up and, you know, reward you, I guess, for doing well at your job year after year. Once you hit that GS7 level, you will stay there because that's kind of where the job ends. But this assessment questionnaire, just like the other one, is asking you how you qualify for the GS7 or the GS5 level. Because you could also come in at a higher grade, you can put in how you might qualify for one of those higher grades, and you know, that's fine. And then it'll get into the details, you know, and this one is looking, you know, assembles, evaluates, and prepares field laboratory data for analysis, you know, doing technical work, actually doing field work. I believe there's, yeah, you know, using a GPS system. This is where I would be specific if you know it, like the brand and the type of GPS that you're using. I've heard another horror story from Apostle Islands where they tried to get someone that they knew hired as a seasonal biotech, and he didn't put that he used a GPS before, and the hiring office bounced him back because I guess we had put in as a criteria that we wanted somebody who could use a GPS. So I can't emphasize that enough about how specific you want to be in your resume. Just be very detailed. With these questionnaires, it's also good to look at them because when you're creating a federal resume and you want to be detailed and specific, and so it becomes long, like multiple pages, this is a good way to kind of know what people are looking for as far as categories. So when I show you some resume examples, I'll get more into that. But anyway, this is just a good example of a hydrotech position that comes from BLM, but it's under the Department of Interior, so it is similar to some of the ones that you see with USGS as well. Going back to USA Jobs. Come back. Okay. All right, here we go. Sorry about that. So back on USA Jobs, I have already actually logged into my personal account, but if you've never logged into USA Jobs before or created an account, that's something you're going to want to do. In your account, you'll have the option of saving searches for jobs. So you don't have to type in all that stuff that I did at the beginning with, I'm looking for things that are open to the public. I'm looking for something in the National Park Service. You can save searches. And to do that, actually you start with a search. So just like we were back, searching for the National Park Service for jobs, we want it open to the public, whatever. Then you can click, if you're logged into your account, if there isn't, you haven't logged into your account, you can't save a search. So you can just click this to save this search once you've set all of the filters that you want on here. You can also set the pay grade. So this is helpful for folks who are looking for a particular pay grade, once you're in college. So at GS4 to GS7 level, you can set on your search. So it's not giving you positions that are, things that you wouldn't qualify for. So you just click Save the Search. Then you'll just name it. So this one, whatever, NPS. And then you can decide how frequently you want USA Jobs to email you a list of job applications. And I would suggest, if you're really serious about trying to work, particularly some of the seasonal positions, to get a daily email. And that's going to sound really overwhelming, but a lot of the seasonal positions, they only have the announcements open for 24 hours. And that's because so many people apply to them. So you'll see on these job announcements, like this dispatcher one with the National Park Service, it says it's open. Well, this is actually an anomaly, because they're always desperately looking for, they're always looking for dispatchers, so they leave that one open forever. So this fire position is Helitac out of Yellowstone, and it is open from October 26th until November 13th. However, some of these, they will tell you in the job announcement that they will close this announcement once they have received 30 applications, which may be sooner than the closing date. So that November 13th is just a date that is not a guarantee. If they receive 30 applications, they may close this announcement just like they did to the student one that I wanted to show you today. They got their max applications that they were willing to accept, and then they close it. However, they are required to leave a job announcement up for at least 24 hours. So not to put the pressure on, but you want to have a resume ready to go. And if you get an email with a job that you'd be interested in, apply to it right away. It does unfortunately eat up a lot of your time when I know you're also trying to be students. So that's just something to know. And with your search, that you can save it and then be emailed regularly about open jobs that are available. I think that's really the only way to really keep track of what's out there. Otherwise, you're stuck searching a new search every time you log into USA Jobs. So in your profile, it'll ask you a bunch of, like the usual stuff that a profile would ask you. But you also have a section for documents. And the documents are where your resumes are stored, and you have two options with USA Jobs. You can upload a resume. So I upload a PDF of my resume, and that's what I use when I apply to jobs. But USA Jobs also has a resume builder that I actually do recommend for people first starting out with applying to federal jobs, and you just name it whatever, example, and it will go bit by bit. It does ask you to provide work experience. So if you don't have much for work experience, this is going to be a little slim and can be a little harder to demonstrate your knowledge in this really tightly formatted type of resume. So if you don't have a lot of work experience, you may want to go with creating your own resume and uploading it. But this will ask you all the questions that HR wants to know about your work experience. They will want to know your employer name, your job title, the address. They also want to know the date or when you started and the year, because they will use this to evaluate how much work experience you actually have. So it's really important to put in, when you started a job, when you ended a job, and then on average, how many hours per week. The salary portion is optional. I've never listed my salary for any reason in USA Jobs, but it is totally optional. Lots of people do. I don't have a suggestion one way or the other. But once you fill in all this basic information about your work experience, you then actually get to put in, duties, accomplishments, and related skills. There are only 5,000 characters available to use in this section. So that can be really, can be limiting if you're trying to do anything out of the ordinary. And then it'll go through, and you can add your education, which is also important, especially if you're trying to qualify. You can add any relevant coursework, licensures, and certifications in this section under your education. And it probably won't let me go any further because I don't have anything to put in here. And then you can list your references, add references, and then it will also let you add things like job-related training, language skills. This is actually a big one for the Park Service because we have visitors from all over the world. So that's kind of interesting. If you do have any language skills, that's great to put in there. Any organizations or affiliations that you're part of are great to put in there. Or if you've done any publications or co-authored publications, this is really important. And you can add information, and this is just for any extra kind of information. Anything you want to detail about volunteer experience or, honors awards, that kind of stuff could go in there. The advantage of this resume builder is that it will force you to put in all the information that HR is looking for. It will ask you exactly what they want to know. So with creating your own, you do run the risk that you might forget to put in like when you started and ended a job and how many hours per week you worked. If you're worried about not remembering to put everything in, then start with the USA Jobs resume builder rather than creating your own and uploading it. The other thing is
Caroline, can I jump in with a question?
Yes.
So there's a question in the chat. For the first time in creating a federal resume, would it be better to include everything you can with all experience and further, or would it be better to create a specific independent resume?
If you're doing this for the first time, depending on what your past work experience is, I would almost include everything. And that sounds crazy, but I hired somebody once. She stood out because she was a Girl Scout. And that's just like extra information that, when I'm looking at a pile of resumes, I used to supervise the Northern Great Lakes Visitor Center and hire both Park Service temporary employees and then Northland students. But, when I'm looking at a stack of resumes and, sometimes they do get to be looking a little similar. It was something that stood out to me because I'm a Girl Scout. And so I think putting as many things on there as you can that might distinguish you from another candidate, and you never know when the hiring official looking at your actual resume is going to be like, oh, that's really cool. She's a Girl Scout. Or I shouldn't tell this story, but the story is so funny because it is an anomaly. My husband works for the National Park Service as a park ranger. And when he applied to his job at Apostle Islands, he had on his resume as a joke that he cuts his own hair, which he does. I mean, that's true. But when he applied, he forgot to take it off his resume. He didn't look closely. And so it was on there and it got here. And when they were looking at resumes for people to hire for his position, his supervisor saw it and was like, oh, this guy's funny. And so we got an interview and then ended up here as a permanent. So don't put like I cut my own hair on there because that's ridiculous. But that's just a good example of there are things that you've been a part of, probably whether they're in high school, independently, those things are worth putting on there. My example is Girl Scouts, but it's worth putting on there because volunteer experience, because you might identify with a hiring official, or a hiring official might identify with you and pick you up out of a crowd and give you an interview, which then is your real time to shine and potentially get hired.
Awesome. Thank you for answering that.
So anyway, the other thing on your documents will also, in addition to resumes, you can upload other documents. So this is where you put your transcripts. I have my transcripts on here still. I don't usually apply with them anymore, but for a very long time, probably the first like 6 or 7 years I was working for the Park Service, I would just include my transcripts so that people could see what coursework I had taken. Because for some jobs it's valuable, particularly in the natural sciences, to have that information available for a hiring official to just look at. Make sure you're taking courses that are relevant or rigorous, and not taking like basket weaving and trying to say that you're a fisheries major. So I would encourage you, even if you're not qualifying based on education, if you've got your transcripts, upload them and just attach them with your documentation to go in for a job announcement. It's just something extra that, again, can help you stand out to a hiring official. So with resumes, in addition to being detailed, and they can be very long, I will confess my resume is about 9 pages long at this point. You don't get there until you've been working for a while, so don't make that your goal right off the bat. But definitely, you can have more than 1 or 2 pages if you need it. That's absolutely acceptable. I think so often it's drilled into our heads that you don't want to make a resume longer than a page. You do sometimes, particularly with the federal government. So I'm going to pull up some examples of resumes, maybe. Here we go. Okay, we covered that. Federal resumes. Okay, so we covered a bit the difference between using USA Jobs and a PDF. Use a standard font, size 12, because you're not trying to squeeze this into a page. Please don't go to some tiny font to try to fit everything. It will make hiring officials blind, and we don't like that. I can't hit on this enough, but make sure you're listing the number of hours you worked per week and dates you held a position. This can be challenging for positions that are kind of on call. So I was a substitute teacher for a while, and that was hard for me to quantify. And I just put 8 to 24 hours a week. And I know that HR, when they looked at that, were only giving me work experience for 8 hours a week because that was at the low end. You want to have your current contact information. So this could be, a current physical address, and you could also list a permanent physical address on there as well. Make sure you've got volunteer experience on there, education information, and then make sure you've got supervisor contact info on there. We as hiring officials do want to be able to contact your previous supervisors as long as it's okay with you. I understand, and we all understand, that there will be sometimes where you may have had a job and circumstances were not good. And so, maybe getting a reference check for that supervisor is not a good idea. The only time that becomes a red flag for us is if it's every supervisor you've had a problem with. But it's okay if there is one or two that, like, don't contact this person for a reference check. You can list other people for references. This is an example in the USA Jobs resume builder from somebody that I know who works for the National Park Service. This is how it appears when it comes to the hiring official, their education experience, and you can list more than one school. So that's important to know too. This is another example. This is, I've got it.
Caroline, there's a question that came in the chat. Can I ask that?
Yes.
So as far as for the dates you held the position, would it be okay if it is only the month, or do you need the exact date?
Yes. So when I show a little bit more of my resume, I have the month because I don't know all the dates, the exact dates that I worked in specific positions. I only started to know that information when I got into the Park Service, because there's a form called an SF-50 that if you start working for the federal government, you'll become very familiar with, that actually lists out your actual date. So yes, the month and the year is fine. This is, from a PDF, so this is mine. So I list out my education. I do list my GPA. If you don't have a really high GPA, you don't have to list it. It's not something that we're really looking for as a hiring official. But if you do have a, stellar GPA, if you're graduating with honors, that kind of stuff, definitely list it. Don't hide that stuff. But if you're not, like, you don't have to list that by any means. It's not required.
What would be the cutoff for you?
Honestly, if you're getting below, if you're dipping down into a 2-point something, I maybe just wouldn't put that on there.
Okay, thank you.
That would just be my suggestion. So this is another example from a PDF resume, and this is mine. This is an example of how maybe to organize some of your work experience, because when you're getting really specific and really detailed, sometimes it can turn into a laundry list. And so when you're looking at those questionnaire questions beforehand, you can pick out, like, this is budget, so I realize this doesn't apply to most of you, but you could pick out, like, under this particular position, I was a budget technician. If you were working as a lab tech or, whatever your job title was, you could then have a category that you talk about your experience in that job running labs. You could talk about analysis of data. You could then have a section about collecting data, something like that, where you kind of organize what you did in a meaningful way, so that a hiring official could be like, oh, okay, so I can look at you or look at your resume quick and say, oh, this is all their field experience under this particular job. So, you could list out, I went out looking for werewolves and whatever. But seriously, just trying to organize it in a meaningful way can be really challenging with a federal resume. And I'm always really impressed by people who can do that. And this becomes more critical the more work experience you gain. When you're first starting out, your jobs may not be super detailed. So there may not be that much to share about it. And that's fine, especially when you're applying to lower graded positions like a GS3, GS4, GS5. Like, we don't expect you to have endless amounts of work experience at that point. But you can see in this example, I listed out, that I used Microsoft Excel, and AFS is a budget program for the Park Service. So it's, listing out these specific things that you've done. It does make a difference when the hiring office is looking at your resume. This is a good example from somebody that I know. This is from the USA Jobs Resume Builder again, where they listed out, a job where they were part-time while they're going to high school. It is all one clump here, which is fine. It can be a little, I don't know. You want to try to organize it. But he lists here, the types of equipment that he used. This is going to be critical if you're talking about field work, things like that. List out equipment that you've used. 1-ton truck here. So just be specific, especially if you're operating any ATVs, UTVs, kind of things in the field. That's important to add. Boats. Speaking from somebody who works at a water park, that's critical information for a hiring official to see and know. This is another one where it's, this was a work study position that I listed. I listed this is where I just had the month because I didn't know the exact date that I started. I did 20 hours a week, but it was only while I was in college, which our school year ran from August through May. So that's just an example of how you could list that stuff if you've got work study experience. And this one, I tried to organize here at the bottom, my promotional materials. I was, doing PR with just extra bullets and numbers just to try and give it some organization rather than just having a full list of everything that I've done. This is another one, and this is for somebody who's actually working for National Park Service at the time, and just being very detailed about, the type of generators that they were working with, the licensures that you may pick up or qualifications you may pick up. Heck, if you have CPR and first aid, make sure that's in your resume too. Any sort of certifications you hold are great to put on a resume, and they're really valuable. This is volunteer experience. You could, if you have a significant amount of volunteer experience, and I don't mean like lots like this, I mean like if you volunteered really consistently with an organization, that's another great thing to list out, the dates that you worked and the hours that you worked. So I worked formerly for interpretation and education, and when I was applying to those jobs, I had my experience with the Natural History Museum as a volunteer listed out. I used to list out, the time period that I worked for them, month and year, how many hours a week I worked, and I had more details about what I was doing as a providing tours and things like that. So don't undersell your volunteer experience because that counts as work experience in the federal government. We've hit on this, but affiliations, this is just how I have it. You could also have a skills section if you're building your own resume. Skills section for things like, any sort of skills you picked up in field work or class that you can't necessarily account for under work experience, volunteer experience. So if you've got to do certain things like run ArcGIS for ArcMap, put that in there. Make a skills section. That's also important experience that sometimes can be really hard to quantify and qualify in other areas of a resume. And last but not least, for resumes, I really want to hit on references. Make sure your contact information for your resume, for your references, is up to date. This may mean you have to get in touch with somebody that you haven't talked to in a while. And I know that takes time, but it's really important that a hiring official can be able to reach out via email or a phone call to get a reference. They should all be professionals. You know, don't put your great aunt who loves you dearly, but, you know, isn't a professional reference. And then indicate on there, if you aren't listing your supervisor with the job, so in the USA Jobs resume builder, they ask specifically for your supervisor's name and contact information. But if you're creating your own and uploading it, you'll just want to make a note on your references list that somebody was your supervisor for a position. And certainly you can put coworkers on there, other people you've worked with over the years. I used to work for the Park Service down in St. Croix National Scenic Riverway, and I worked a lot with the naturalists for some of the state parks along the Riverway that were with the Minnesota DNR, and I had them listed as references for me as well. I include references on the last page. It is the last page of my resume document. It's just a list of references. I wouldn't say that there's a set number that you should have, but quality is really what matters. So you'll want to make sure it's a good list, people who are willing to speak to your qualifications and your attitude, because when we're calling references, you know, we can see your qualifications on your resume, but when we're calling references, we want to know, what's your attitude like? Are you positive? What's your work ethic like? Are you willing to work hard? Do you get along with your coworkers or your teammates or whatever? Any of that, that's what we're calling references for. So make sure your references are people that can speak to your qualities as a person, not just your qualifications for a job. So with that, that was a lot of information. And hopefully you stayed with me for most of it. I feel like I do this a little different every time I give this presentation, but I am open to questions at this point. If you want to put them in a chat, or if you want to ask them, that's fine too.
While we wait for some questions to come in, one of the things that I hear a lot, and I think we could use some clarification on, is sometimes you'll hear that a resume for a federal job will go through an actual applicant tracking software. So like a computer will be able to determine if you get to, you know, a real person's eyes. So is that a real thing?
So for the National Park Service, I can say that for the most part, it's not a real thing. I can't speak for other agencies, but we don't have that software at this point, to my knowledge. It is, however, because you're dealing with people who are working in the central office, so like our hiring office is in Hot Springs, South Dakota, they don't really know anything about Apostle Islands. And so when they're reviewing applicants, they are really looking that your resume has words and details that mimic the questions that you're asked in the questionnaire and in that detail section of the job announcement. So that's why if you can almost verbatim put some of that language in to your work experience or your volunteer experience in your resume, do it, because they are playing a bit of a matching game.
What about like a direct hire, or, you know, if you know somebody who works for the Park Service, are there any ways to kind of, you know, skirt around or get up in the process or something like that?
Not really. Pretty much everything has to be hired through USA Jobs. Unfortunately, there is not a real workaround. The student and the recent graduate ones are the closest thing that we have to that. And previously, it wasn't called, they call it Pathways now. It used to be called SCEP and STEP. But Pathways lets you come in as a student. It definitely knocks down your competition for those jobs because there aren't, let's just be honest, there aren't as many students as there are just general people. And then most times they'll actually convert you to a permanent position. So that's a good way to get in if you can. It's not always a for sure, and that's the biggest thing with the federal government is there is never a guarantee. There are lots of different ways that you can get in. That Land Workforce Management Act was the best thing that Congress, I think, has done in a long time. Just a little personal bias because I was seasonal for 7 years. And if that had been around, I could have started competing for permanent jobs much earlier. And I think gotten in a little sooner. Just something to know is that, I did work for 7 years as a seasonal, and then a job opened up at Mississippi National River and Recreation Area, which is an urban partnership park in the Twin Cities, and it was part-time. And so not a lot of people applied to it because it was only part-time. But my folks live in the cities, so I literally moved back into my parents' basement and was working part-time for the Park Service, but that's how I got my permanent status. And then I ended up coming back to Apostle Islands for a full-time year-round gig in interpretation. So sometimes you are going to be taking jobs that are less desirable just to get your foot in the door. And while I was working part-time, I then substitute taught, and that was how I made money. So just remember that, the first job that you apply to and the first job that you get as a permanent job may not be your dream one. In fact, it probably won't be. And that's really okay, because once you're in, just enjoy the experience, and then you can move on, to bigger and better things.
And that's advice I, hear from a lot of people, that I work with. That's kind of the reality sometimes.
And I will say that the reason I was picked up by Mississippi is because I had worked at St. Croix National Scenic Riverway as a seasonal, and I did work education programs with some of their staff. And so networking is still a thing in the federal government, even though you have to jump through all of these hiring hoops to begin with. Networking is still a thing. They saw my name, they knew my name, and they called me for an interview and hired me into the position because they knew that I was who I was and that I was well qualified. And it's just because I had worked with them for a couple education programs in the previous years.
Awesome. Okay, well, I think we're probably going to be wrapping it up unless somebody has a question. Is it usually worth it to apply for a job where the application is only open for 24 hours, or does this indicate that they already have someone in mind? That's a good question.
If it is a temporary job, apply to it. They don't have somebody in mind. This is just a function. This short time period is a function of our HR process because they used to open these up for the whole time and they would get thousands of applicants and they couldn't sort through them. So in 2017, we ended up with this weirdo thing where a bunch of parks couldn't get seasonals hired because we didn't have lists of names because it was taking so long. So if it's a temporary job or a seasonal job, apply for it. If you're looking at a permanent job that has a really short time period, there is the potential that they have somebody in mind, but it could also be that they're just trying to cut down on the number of applicants they get. So I would say, I mean, once you have an established resume, especially if it's covering pretty much everything, I would say go for it, particularly because once you get practice at applying to those jobs, it doesn't take you very long to do that.
Awesome advice and really good question. If anybody else has, another question to ask, feel free to pop it in the chat or to, put your camera on to ask.
Another question that I sometimes get asked that I realize I didn't cover in this presentation is cover letters. You certainly could upload a cover letter into the documents section of USA Jobs and use it. If my personal advice, both from experience as an applicant and as a hiring official, if you're applying to a seasonal or temporary job, you do not need a cover letter. It looks really bad when your application shows up, your name is on my list. I click to open your resume. I see you have a cover letter. I click to open it, and you're telling me how much you want to work at Yellowstone National Park because you put on the wrong cover letter. Like, just not worth it, you know? And that has happened. I've really opened up cover letters, and I have immediately looked at those applicants and been like, you're at the bottom of the list now. So I would say for temporary and seasonal, it's probably not worth the effort. Permanent jobs, absolutely, especially if you don't know the person who's hiring. I have lucked out once I got into the Park Service permanently that I have known every person that I've interviewed with because of networking. And so I have not used a cover letter for permanent positions. I know.
Wow, that's amazing.
Some people do, and I really recommend it if you don't know the park or the refuge or the agency really well, and use it as an opportunity to make your personal pitch about why you really want that job. So that's just my thought. In the
That's
private
good advice.
Yeah, in the private industry, always use the cover letter, but in the federal government, it's so-so.
Interesting. And certainly, I mean, it does go the same, as far as like a cover letter, that's the opportunity, like you were saying, to give yourself some personality because a resume that's, several pages long and it just kind of lists all this out and, how do you kind of develop a personality?
And it can really, especially in the Park Service, because these parks are in locations that can be really meaningful to people. If you have a personal connection to the area, we want to read about that. That's really good to know because oftentimes, especially with the Park Service, we're in remote areas. It can be really hard for people who have never been there to get in with the community, kind of assimilate. If you already have a connection that's, unrelated to the park or unrelated to the refuge or whatever, it's great to know about that as a hiring official. It does weigh on our mind.
Awesome. So you can say, I grew up going to this park and camping there as a child, or my aunt and uncle lived down the road and it X, Y, or Z.
Yeah. I mean, you don't have to get really mushy about it, but just like, let people know that you have a connection and that it matters.
Great. Okay. Caroline, thank you so much for your time and all of this information. And I hope that everybody felt like it was helpful. If you have other questions, that you think of afterward, of course, let me know and I can connect you. If you're interested in a more specific question, Caroline, as long as you're okay with that idea.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. All right. Is there anything else that you feel is important to mention, Caroline?
I don't have specific dates, but I can tell you that Park Service seasonal jobs for biotechs, maintenance, interpretation will be going out from like December through February is usually kind of the high time. So get your resume together.
This is a really good time to be taking this workshop right now so that you know what you're doing when you get to applying. Awesome. Okay. Thank you, everybody who attended tonight. And thank you so much, Caroline, for going through all of this information. Have a wonderful night, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.